Hello. Ooh, we have sound. How wonderful. Hello. Gosh, that's so great. What a radical idea, huh? Sound at a speech. So anyway, my name is Jennifer Dwyer. I'm the president of the Savannah Council on World Affairs, and I want to welcome all of you to our last program of this fiscal year, so to speak. And before I introduce our distinguished guest, as always, I would like to identify our sponsors, because without their generous donations, we would not have these wonderful programs and guest speakers. So as you know, Kreitz is one of our platinum sponsors, supporting us throughout the year, and Kreitz has served the Savannah and Coastal Empire for over 80 years and is the exclusive dealer, as it says, for all these wonderful makes of cars, both new and old. So we'd like to thank Kreitz for their continuing support. Also, similarly, Planters Inn is a platinum sponsor supporting our programs throughout the year. They offer a lovely boutique hotel with extravagant amenities, lovely rooms, and a classic historic district location. When you have guests or want that staycation downtown, consider Planters Inn. It's a lovely place to stay. And this evening, we have, I'd like to welcome Four Seasons Travel. Since 1980, Four Seasons Travel has been transforming each trip into a one-of-a-kind experience. They offer outstanding support and arrange extraordinary travel experiences. For your next journey, start at Four Seasons Travel. And we have sort of a special opportunity to welcome Rebecca Player, the owner of Four Seasons Travel. And we'd like to thank her personally for supporting our mission. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And our last bit of business before we begin, please note the dates of our fall speakers program. More details will be coming out, but hopefully this sort of wets your whistle and gets you interested in what's coming from September. So we will be taking the summer off, so to speak. We work very hard during the summer, but we don't have speakers during the summer. And at last, I have the pleasure to introduce our speaker, Ambassador Philip Reeker. He will be talking about victory in Europe, where are U.S. Europe relations after 80 years, and where are they headed? As you can see here, he's partner and lead for Europe for the Albright Stonebridge Group of Denton Global Advisors, former acting assistant secretary of state for European and Eurasian Affairs, former charge d'affaires at the U.S. Embassy in the United Kingdom. So I will turn the microphone that's actually working over to Ambassador Philip Reeker. Please give him a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me try to put this here. Earlier in my career, I was a spokesman at the State Department. And if you watch the press briefings on TV, you realize that the spokesman gets to hide behind a big lectern like this. So I feel very at home. And I am absolutely delighted to be here. I want to thank, of course, Jennifer, the whole set of sponsors. I'm impressed to see that there are sponsors that support these kinds of outreach and international focus in our towns and cities across the United States. It's not just in Washington, D.C. or New York, where we are paying attention to what goes on in the world around us. And I particularly want to thank Larry Silverman, Ambassador Silverman, a longtime friend and colleague, someone I've looked up to, I've worked with, who has a tremendous Foreign Service career. I want to say behind him, but I think it's still there because he's still contributing and doing this is a great thing. I know he's brought to you a number of our colleagues, former colleagues, but I think in the Foreign Service world we remain sort of colleagues for life and continue to think about the United States and how we interact with the rest of the world and why that's important to us. And so again, I really commend the Savannah Council on World Affairs for bringing people together to engage in these critically important discussions about the world beyond our borders. It's this kind of strengthening of global awareness, I think, that will sustain our country through difficult times, through times of division, differing views, controversy, in a world that has become increasingly complicated and uncertain, not exactly what people may have expected just even a few years ago, when we felt that, as some put it, we'd reached the end of history, The end of the Cold War meant we were going to live in an era of great prosperity. Technology was taking us new places. The internet was transforming the world. And of course, it's turned out a little bit differently than that. We all recognize that. I am particularly grateful that I could come down today and finish out your season of speakers looking at different parts of the world and doing that to talk about Europe. Europe is where I spent most of my career overseas. I did serve in Iraq, as many of us did for a while in 2007 and 2008, joined by my wife, who's also a career member of the Foreign Service. We went during that time when lots of Foreign Service people were going to Iraq in a period of controversy, a difficult time, but it was an interesting opportunity. What stood out to me then as a Europeanist, as we say, was how many of our European allies and friends were there with us in the Green Zone, with our military troops, standing with us, even though the decision to go into Iraq, of course, as some may recall, was rather controversial at the time. But the transatlantic bond, I think, between the United States and Europe was such a crucial part of that. Now, I just got back last night, so if I start to fade, just come and poke me. From a 4-day trip to Europe, this is what I find, despite all the travel I did as Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Deputy Assistant Secretary before that, when I was often going 2 or 3 times a month across the pond, as we say. In the private sector now, I'm finding that I'm doing just as much travel to keep up with the kind of engagement that's necessary to serve the clients, companies, businesses, foundations that we at the Albright Stonebridge Group work with. It is the firm that was founded by Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. When she left office, she wanted to take sort of the model of the State Department and shift it into what we call commercial diplomacy, offering companies, but also foundations. We work with the Gates Foundation, which is one of our largest clients, and some smaller foundations, some nonprofits, to provide them advice, strategies for how to maneuver in the complex international world. And for European companies or American companies wanting to work with Europe, it's a particularly complicated time. So I came back from a quick trip to North Macedonia, Skopje, the country where I was first ambassador back in 2008 after Iraq. I was nominated to be the 5th United States ambassador to what was then the Republic of Macedonia. They later solved the question over their name, which was a great controversy with Greece in particular, and became the Republic of North Macedonia. But that was in the heart of the Balkans, part of Yugoslavia that broke up. And it wasn't that long ago where those were the issues that were on our televisions every night, that were on the front pages, where our diplomacy was focused, where our military was engaged and involved with the difficulties in the Balkans, the heart of Europe, where 50 years after the end of World War II, we had an outbreak of war, what was really a civil war as Yugoslavia broke apart in the post-Cold War era, and those old ghosts of nationalism, populism, history that, as the saying goes, the Balkans produce more history than they can consume, drove these republics that had made up Yugoslavia, a country that was, by all standards, relatively successful, and had they stayed together as a single country, would rival Poland in terms of the size of its economy, its population, its influence, its power. Now we have, a different situation with 7 different countries. Those were things I worked on, the remnants of Yugoslavia during much of my career. But having flown over to Macedonia to speak at a conference and meet with the Prime Minister and some other businesses there, looking at ways to adapt to the new economic realities that we face and to the new transatlantic relationship, it was an interesting time for me to see and hear from some of these people who are really questioning what's going on in America. From inside, we're often asking that, and we have debates and discussions. We had difficult political campaign, and you can only imagine what it's like for people who have watched America and counted on us always being the stable force where we knew what we were doing, even if we didn't get it right at the first time. As Winston Churchill said, once they've tried everything else, they'll always come out with the right solution. That's America, so we stick with them. Some of them, frankly, are asking, do we stick with you? What is this about? Do you care about us? Because there's a feeling in Europe, and I hear this from many corners and many contacts, that the United States is less interested in the world as a whole, but certainly less interested in Europe. And I think that is right now, in terms of policy, in terms of government and our official engagement, I think that is true, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But I think my underlying thesis is that Europe is still vitally important to all of us. And I think you and Savannah know that as well as anybody. You look at this port, and while this is a global port and you're having ships come to and fro from all over the world, Europe is a key destination. It's Rotterdam, as I heard today, that is looking at Savannah as a model of how do we modernize and expand what is one of the largest ports on that side of the Atlantic. So a relationship between two countries, two peoples, two regions is far more than just the bilateral relationship between two governments. It's far more than any single administration can change, and how one leader or set of policies may affect those relationships. There's a lot more, whether it's economics, trade, commerce, heritage, values. These are the things that bring us together. I flew back yesterday and got into Washington Dulles around 4 o'clock, and was fortunate that the traffic wasn't too bad. And I got to my office downtown just in time to host a group of Georgians. Not you guys, but people from Georgia, the country, which was, of course, a former Soviet republic, but a country with a long and ancient heritage, great wine, excellent food. Not all that different from Savannah, but these Georgians were coming over on a program called Select USA, and they were led by our current ambassador to Georgia, a colleague of Larry's and mine. These are businessmen from Georgia, businessmen and women, who are interested in investing in the United States. And this is a program that's been sponsored by the Commerce Department, the International Trade Administration, for a couple of decades now. Happens every year. And they'd come over as a group, the largest per capita group from Georgia, a relatively small country of about 4 million people, to participate and hear about what kind of opportunities there were for them to come and invest here or to pursue joint ventures all across the United States. It's not what people usually expect, because so often it's Americans who have gone abroad, worked with the State Department many times to find opportunities for their own investment overseas. So I was very pleased to sort of greet these Georgians. I used to work a lot on affairs in that part of the world, the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. And I told them, of course, that I actually had to leave the party as I began to fade about 24 hours into my day, that I was going to be coming down to see other Georgians, you all, today. So these are not static relationships that we have. And sometimes, while they're living relationships that are often strained, I think it's important to reflect a little bit upon where we've been and perhaps where we're going. And I really look forward to then your questions and engagement afterwards, so we can have a bit of a discussion through the rest of the evening. I think in 2025, this U.S. Europe relationship really is at a crossroads in many aspects. And I think it's fascinating to look at it in the context of what we just celebrated or marked, honored a week ago today. On the 8th of May, the Russians would say the 9th of May, we mark VE, or Victory in Europe Day, the end of World War II in Europe. And last week it was 80 years since the German surrender and the end of the war there. Of course, 3 months from today, on the 15th of August, we will mark Victory in Japan Day, after the dropping of the atomic bombs. which ended World War II, the greatest conflagration that the planet had ever seen, and set us out on a course over the past 80 years, which is what I think all of us, regardless of our generation, have come to know as the world order. So we know the history. I learned much of it from my grandfather. He was the son of German immigrants who came at the turn of the previous century from Germany and made their way first to Cleveland and then to Washington State, where my great-grandparents were farmers. He studied engineering and then was, of course, joined the U.S. Navy and went back to Europe as a naval officer and fought in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic to bring about the victory that we mark 80 years later. He never talked about it a lot, but I know it was a crucial part of his formation, and that link to Europe, having gone there to fight together to defeat Nazism, to defeat totalitarianism, to bring freedom to the people of the continent from where his own ancestors had come, was a very important thing for him. And I think it was important for many Americans. That generation, the greatest generation as we called it, has largely passed from view. And it is, I think, a reflection in some ways of how we approach Europe and look at it, that we've lost the real experience there. The people that were on the beaches at Normandy in 1944 are no longer with us. And those experiences, while forever preserved in film and popular culture, are no longer ones that we can feel close to. So, in 1947, you imagine Europeans or Americans standing in even the great cities of Europe and try to project forward what you would see 80 years later. No one in 1947 could imagine that London or Paris or anywhere in Germany, which was largely destroyed, would live with the level of prosperity and security that they have for the past 80 years. We put in place a world order, as we call it, with alliances like NATO, where we pledged to together preserve a security. And with security, we created a space, certainly in the North Atlantic and Europe and Eurasia space, unprecedented in history. These were lands where wars were common every decade or two, never more than a century without massive conflagrations. And we put in place, with the United States as part of it, Madeleine Albright used to say, the United States is a European power. Now, a lot of people would dispute that today. Are we a European power? Last summer, I was invited to participate, even though I'd retired from the Foreign Service, at the 75th anniversary of NATO's formation. There was a big ceremony in Washington. All the heads of state of by then 32 members of this alliance came to Washington to reflect, but to underscore the importance of this alliance, which had provided not just security, but created the space to have an unprecedented level of prosperity for all of our countries in this region. Now, just a couple years later, people question whether NATO will continue or not. For more than 75 years, the transatlantic partnership had helped ensure that peace and promote democracy, uphold these rules-based order that we talk about. But I think the key thing here is to know that history alone, as we stand on this 80th anniversary, is not enough to sustain a relationship. It has to be continuously renewed, particularly as the world around us changes. This year also marks the 50th anniversary of what's known as the Helsinki Final Act. That was a set of principles that was adopted not only by what we call the Western world, but also by the then Soviet Union. It was a remarkable thing that the Soviets agreed to this set of principles, a set of rights guaranteed under this Helsinki Act 50 years ago, that we all had certain principles. It's also this year the 30th anniversary of the Dayton Accords. That was, of course, what brought finally peace to the war in Bosnia, which was, as I said earlier, the worst thing in terms of war that the continent had seen since World War II. Now, Bosnia remains an unsettled place. It's not been a huge success, but that effort brought about by American diplomats, Larry and I know many of them. Richard Holbrooke, a famous diplomat, was one who really pushed through this agreement to bring an end to that interethnic warfare. And while Bosnia itself is not a great success story, certainly not economically, those countries, the former Yugoslav countries, have many of them moved on to become members of NATO themselves, members of the European Union, and peace is largely maintained there. But 30 years on, one has to ask, would we be able to do that again? Would we take the leadership role that had to be from the United States to bring an end to that war? And a lot of Europeans question that now. They are, just in the past year, beginning to say, we've got to do these things on our own. We cannot count on the Americans to come and do the right thing. That's a view that I've been finding pervasive, and certainly just this past week was hearing for the first time from people who I would not have expected to question that. I think I have a fairly unique position from which to look at these questions. I was a 31-year veteran of the Foreign Service when I retired 2 years ago. After 25 years, I had served in Italy for a few years and was thinking about retiring then, and was asked to come and be the political or foreign policy advisor to the commander of U.S. forces in Europe. Now, U.S. European Command, as it's known, is based in Stuttgart, Germany. Some of you may have been there or served there. I had been familiar with it because as diplomats at our embassies in Europe, we often engage, of course, very closely with our military counterparts. The commander asked me to come and serve with him, and I did that, and in fact, it turned out to be probably my favorite assignment in the Foreign Service, because we were working on European issues with our European allies in the heart of Europe, and yet our job was to integrate diplomacy from the State Department and defense, working with, but not under NATO, and thinking about all of the factors that were critical, and looking at rising threats. So in the years I was there, from 2017, we had already seen Putin's Russia rearm and attack in 2014 Crimea, annexing that illegally from its neighbor, Ukraine. And of course, just a few years later, in 2022, we saw the full-scale invasion by Putin in what he thought would be a 3 or 4 day exercise to defeat Ukraine and essentially reintegrate it into Russia. So the threats were beginning to rise. What we thought was a great dividend of peace and a changed era made us think again that we had to focus more on defense spending, and that meant we had to focus on other economic issues, resource allocation, and these were all the issues that in 2017, when President Trump came to office in the first place, began to get more prominence in a much stronger, harsher way. For decades, certainly in my career, U.S. presidents and U.S. diplomats had all said to Europe, you've got to spend more, you've got to contribute more to this alliance. And the Europeans would often say, yes, we know that, we're going to do that. But frankly, they didn't. And I think that's something that has certainly been acknowledged now. And if you look, and you'll hear a lot more about this in the coming weeks before the NATO summit that will take place in The Hague, the Netherlands, almost every one of the NATO allies is up to the goal of spending over 2% of their GDP on defense. And many of them are well past that, and you're going to hear an announcement from the Secretary General, Secretary General Rutte, who was the former Dutch Prime Minister, that everybody needs to spend 3.5% of their GDP on defense because we can see what Russia is doing. While they haven't been able to defeat Ukraine as they expected, And the Ukrainians have shown this remarkable resilience and ingenuity in developing new weapons, using new technologies. Russia is continuing to build and focus much of its economy on building a military might that clearly is a threat to Europe, and I would say a threat to all of us. So those issues are going to continue to be there, but trust has been a bit frayed. With the first Trump administration, there was a lot of talk about this difficulty in U.S. European relations. I used to say, you know, the waters of the Atlantic are choppy. They're whitecaps. And that was clear from the rhetoric, from the dialogue. But I can tell you, working in it, underneath, we were doing a lot in those calmer waters on both sides of the Atlantic. I used to tell Europeans, if you think that we're burning bridges because of the president's approach, just don't burn them from the other side so that we can rebuild, reconstruct, that the structure, the fundamental ties remain. And just like in any family, there is a little bit of tension now and again that we can get through. I think we largely did that. We did a lot at NATO to rebuild the alliance quietly, even as the debate over resources and the suggestions or threats that the United States might leave the alliance were out there. In fact, we left NATO in a stronger place, I think, and modernized NATO in terms of mobility, in terms of interoperability, and indeed increasing the defense spending that was necessary to be able to counter the real threats we had. And that's not just a traditional military threat from Russia, but increasingly hybrid threats, cyber issues, new issues with AI. The Chinese are certainly part of that. And I think NATO, bringing all of these countries, all of this experience, all of this know-how together is much better than trying to deal with these challenges simply alone. And February of 2022, when Putin launched that war, a war we could see he was about to undertake, despite his denials, I think that made us all realize that there were challenges out there. So we came through the first Trump administration, I think, with a renewed sense that we had to make some changes to the relationship, but that the transatlantic relationship was strong. And this time, with the return of President Trump and his administration, there is, I think, a fundamental difference. And I hear it from the Europeans, first with a lot of shock, but now a sense of resignation and concern that we really have hit an inflection point and that the relationship will never be as it was. And that may be the case. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't decide. But my point being, and I will stress this several times throughout the talk tonight, is that it is up to all of us to make sure the relationship does endure, perhaps in a different way, but to look at all of the things that are so important to us in terms of our security, in terms of our prosperity and our economic well-being, and in terms of the values that we share and project. Those are the three crucial things that are important for us. I think you have to look at Europe itself as facing three real challenges. The first is a security threat. They have not maintained their security, and without us, they would be in a really difficult situation. First, of course, the nuclear umbrella that we provide, which was crucial throughout the Cold War and remains crucial against the Russian nuclear threat. But they also need to look at their own economic factors. Europe has declined in terms of its prosperity relative to others because of a decrease in productivity, a decrease in innovation, and they need to get that back. And I think they're now beginning to focus on that a little more because they feel that maybe the United States is not going to be there for them. Maybe they need to compete with us. whether it's going to be through trade wars and the uncertainty of tariffs. I know you had a speaker talk to you a bit about tariffs, and that's something that's very much on the minds of Europeans. Really, it's on the minds of all of us, I think. One day there are tariffs, the next day they're off, then they're on again. How much are they? Where are they? What are they doing? That uncertainty is very difficult. But the question of productivity is something Europe has got to address. And the third piece, after security and productivity, is a concern that really falls into the values pole of this three-legged stool, if you will, between security, prosperity, and values. And that is a real threat from extremism, far right-wing extremism. I'm not talking just a difference between conservatives and liberals, but a real threat from an extremism in Europe that you've seen reflected in some of the election outcomes across the continent, but certainly in some of the parties that have emerged and taken a much more prominent role. So Europe is busy looking at those things and at the same time wondering if their strong relationship with the United States is going to be the same. I think these are things that we can overcome, but it's going to require all of us to decide what our priorities are as communities, as states, and as a country as a whole, not just in terms of commitments to something like NATO, which is based on shared values, but in terms of questions like trade. This is where I think that we increasingly have to become more aware of, inform ourselves of some of the issues like technology. Europeans have a different approach and philosophy to how technology is applied and how it's regulated. They have a Digital Services Act, which is of great controversy and something that the administration has highlighted as something that they're very concerned about. Europe itself is still trying to work out its unity in terms of the European Union, which I think has been a good thing. It's allowed Europe to avoid the wars and the excessive competition that plagued the continent for so long, but it's not without difficulties and challenges. The Brits, the UK, experienced that with Brexit. We all watched that, and it's interesting to see that because of the reaction of President Trump to Europe, that the Brits and the Europeans have sort of gotten back together again. And when I served in the United Kingdom, I often said every day was like being a divorce counselor. You know, they wouldn't talk to each other, and the European diplomats would come to me and say, you know, you've got to get Boris Johnson to, you know, start being nicer. With Boris, that's a little tough. I saw Boris the other day. Actually, he was in Washington last week, and we had a bit of a fun reunion. He remembers my haircut, and I remember his haircut. And we always laugh a little bit about that. And just so you know, Boris and that hair, it's a shtick. It's his thing. It's, you know, you can go into a meeting with him and his hair is perfectly well combed. But then you go downstairs. I was with him with Secretary Pompeo once, and we are heading out of the building and going through number 10 Downing Street. You go down the stairs and around these corridors, and we get to the big black front door that you all see on TV, number 10 Downing Street. We're inside, and Boris theatrically says, "Wait!" And Secretary Pompeo's looking at him, yes. On the other side of that door are cameras. Yes. And Boris bends over and does this. And he's still doing that. So, but Boris had provoked and had a particularly difficult relationship, especially with President Macron of France. And much of that has moved on. And so to see Keir Starmer and Macron both kind of strategizing, how are we going to deal with President Trump? I also often like to think, maybe this is something Trump is just working out to get them back together. I doubt if he would agree with that, but I like to think that that's part of it. I'll finish up by saying, you know, another area that we have always taken for granted, I think, with our European friends is about defending democracy. That's been the basis of our relationship, that we shared the same set of values. In fact, of course, the founders of this country, including what was the colony of Georgia, were here with the same set of values, often leaving behind in Europe things that were of great concern to them. But certainly in the post-World War II era, defending democracy around the world was as crucial as defending it at home. And now, as we've faced what are called sort of illiberal challenges, and the challenge of disinformation, polarization, attacks on institutions, eliminating some of the things, like we've just eliminated the Agency for International Development, and I can tell you there are a lot of people around the world asking, how are we going to deal with some of these crises without the American engagement? Europeans are focusing on this too, just as they thought they were sort of getting their act together by pushing resources to defense, often taking those out of the development portion of the budget. They are faced with a world where there's no longer any development money coming from the United States, and that's an area they brought up. People in North Macedonia, where I just was, were asking, these programs that we've had here, that we've relied upon and appreciated through the Agency for International Development, have all been abolished. In the space of 2 months, they're all gone. People are packing up, they're over. Now, in some cases, I think maybe it's time for some of those things to move on. North Macedonia has been independent. It emerged from Yugoslavia almost 30 years ago. And maybe it's time that they stand on their own two legs, that they take the lessons they've learned, and we've done that. But in other places, I think it's going to be a real challenge. And if anything, I'd say we're giving up the sort of soft power that was, I think, crucial to America's standing in the world and what we did. And this is something that Europeans are concerned about. That I've heard repeatedly, and also from the private sector, from business, is an area that I think we need to examine more closely, and how we move forward on that in the months ahead. So a NATO that's fit for digital age deterrence, that's going to be crucial. Cyberspace and AI integrated into defense planning. An economic relationship that I hope we can get back on a track that's based on trust, resilience, and predictability, and not just efficiency. And joint technology governance. These are areas that we have to be looking at, particularly with the Europeans, as we consider the challenge from China. And there's a great concern in Europe that if the United States gives up on our transatlantic relationship, that people will be driven into the arms of the Chinese. I don't think it's quite that simple, but I think it's something that we need to think about, that as we leave vacuums around the world, whether it's in the transatlantic space or in Africa or other places, the Chinese are very happy to fill them. I'll just close by saying that the transatlantic relationship in these past 80 years, since the end of the war, has itself weathered other wars, wars that were controversial in Iraq and Afghanistan, wars that the Europeans couldn't solve themselves in the former Yugoslavia, challenges in the Middle East and other parts of the world. We've weathered divisions and political shifts, often with open skepticism from within, and yet the relationship still stands. And so while many are questioning whether we truly have passed a point where we can never go back to the relationship we once had with Europe, I think that at its core, the partnership that we call the transatlantic relationship is much more than just about geopolitics. It is about a shared belief that when free people act together, we can align our values, even when we have differences and disagreements. We can align our resources, because I still believe that working together is better than trying to take on these challenges alone. And we have a tradition of a resolve to meet our goals, that we can still shape our future, make it safer, fairer, and indeed freer. It's 2025. 1945 is a long time ago, and these beliefs, I think, are really being tested. And it's just something that if I leave you one thought tonight, we should all be thinking about. What does Europe mean for each and every one of us? Many of you in this room, I suspect, may this summer visit Europe in droves, along with millions of other people in Florence, in London, in Paris. That transcends the politics and the relationship between our government and other governments. That is something that is deeper. That is about American and Americans with Europe and Europeans engaging in exchange, engaging in trade, popular culture. Certainly the heritage that many of us share traces its roots to Europe and different parts of it. So while those beliefs of the relationship are being tested, I think there's some things we can fall back on. And I think it's important that we not try to go back to the past itself, but that we reassess and we speak out and we come together and discuss these issues about how we move forward together and for, again, a more secure, more prosperous world in which the shared values that we have can be expressed and give ourselves a confidence in what we have, similar to what we did 80 years ago. So let me stop there with that sort of rambling set of remarks, hopefully giving you enough questions or provoking something that's even controversial. I'm happy to do that, and turn it over to questions and conversation and a back and forth. And Larry has a mic, I think.
I do, Phil. Thank you so much. And I forgot to mention, this is Ambassador Reeker's first visit to Savannah. Many in the audience will know more about this, what I'm about to say, than I do. But there is another connection because Savannah was the home of the 8th Air Force, which played such a significant role in World War II in bombing runs against Nazi petroleum and sites and everything like that at tremendous human cost to young lives. Here, as a great museum here, actually, there is a museum of the 8th Air Force outside of Savannah. Next time you come, he doesn't have enough time this time, but next time you come, you should visit. But I know there'll be lots of questions, so I open the floor. Put your hand up, I'll try to come around, and I will point out people. Don't worry, I will get to you, so.
I can shout it out.
That's okay, if you want.
You can shout at me. My wife does. So.
Thank you very much for visiting with us. On your last point about exchange and the human connection, do you think the Fulbright program will survive?
Oh, I'm glad you brought up the Fulbright program. For those who aren't familiar with it, it's probably the State Department's, really mainstream program of exchanges, named after Senator Fulbright from Arkansas, who believed back in the 1950s, I guess, when they started it, how important it was. And it has been preserved and protected through budget battles and all kinds of debates in Congress, and we always thought that the name of it and the program itself had such prestige that it would be safe, but to be honest, I'm not sure. The State Department itself is undergoing a major reconstruction, some of that good. It's important, as I know Jim Jeffrey was down talking to you a bit about that, and he testified before Congress. After so many years, it's important to reassess these things, but there are some fundamental things like Fulbright that I really think make a difference. You look at the number of people whose lives have been changed. You look at the sister program, the so-called International Visitor Leadership Program that the State Department has sponsored for something like 60 years, and how many prime ministers and foreign ministers and leaders and Nobel Prize winners were participants in these early exchange programs, because the program is based on our diplomats going out and identifying people in various countries all around the world, not just in Europe, who they see as potential leaders, and bringing them to America so they can understand America and forge bonds and connections that are lifelong. And it's similar to some of the high school exchange programs, which I've seen over the years, are lifelong connections. So people understand what America is about, and Americans can understand what other countries are about and know about the commonalities. So if we lose that program, I think it would be a real shame. And when I was in government and as a career officer, we were not allowed to lobby our congressmen. That was not allowed. But now that I'm out of government, I can tell you we should all be writing our representatives, because I think wherever you are on a political spectrum or about the administration, some of these things are really worth keeping.
And just to foot stomp that, as we say, I think you've heard me say this before, the amount of goodwill we get from foreign students who study in the United States, plus, by the way, it's a huge financial boon to the United States to have these students here.
Yeah.
I was a huge fan of Fulbright, with one exception, because I lived through 3 years in Damascus with first President Hafez al-Assad's foreign policy advisor, and then Bashar al-Assad's, the no longer, thankfully, in office in Damascus.
Always some exceptions, yeah.
Yes, and his foreign policy advisor, and she, Syrian, received 2 Fulbright grants. We don't get it right every time.
During your thoughts, I had a sense that increasingly Europe just had seemed to take the United States for granted. And any time in a relationship that happens, problems develop and then need to be addressed.
I think there has been a period of that. I mean, in my 31 years in the Foreign Service, as I said, much of it serving in Europe or focused on Europe. I do think, as in any relationship, imagine your marriage of 30 years. You begin to take some things for granted. And Europeans are cognizant of that. I think they realized that when the first Trump administration sort of shocked them, not that some of the policies were necessarily that different. It was just how they were approached. As I said, every president, since I've been in the Foreign Service since the early 1990s, every administration was talking about the need for Europe to do more on defense. It was time for Europe to start taking more of its own role. I brought up, of course, the Yugoslav wars, Bosnia, Kosovo, not just because I served there and it was a critical part of the past 80 years, but because those were moments when Europe thought they would stand up and be able to solve these security problems, what were essentially security problems on their own, and weren't able to do it without the United States. And that in and of itself is not horrible. I mean, we weren't able to do what we tried to do in Afghanistan or Iraq without the support and help of allies as well. It's good to work together. But I think they have begun to realize that they need to take this responsibility now, and you hear that. I was at the Munich Security Conference, which you may have read about. It's a big conflagration every year of sort of nerdy policy people like me who go, but also a lot of corporate people and big names. It takes place in Munich, obviously, in February. And every year there's a big official American presence. The vice president has traditionally gone. I think that was the case in every administration I can remember. And this year, Vice President Vance went, and he gave a speech, which you may have heard about, where he just really stuck it to the Europeans. In my own personal view, it was kind of crass and rude. It's not the way my grandmother would have raised me to speak and deliver maybe some criticisms, but they were just completely stunned by that, and also stunned by his kind of attacks on individual countries and his accusations of political bias, and also his sort of open engagement in European elections, sort of saying, we support one group or another. And that kind of shocked them. And that, after seeing this shock, it was on a Friday, and by that Friday night, the shock had sort of turned to a certain sadness, but also an anger. And that was when people started saying, we have got to change, we have got to think about ourselves, because I don't know that we can count on the United States anymore. And that'll be reassessed over time. The Munich Security Conference just had its Washington meetings a week ago. They do this every 4 years when a new administration comes in. They bring a number of people to Washington and invite people in, and Vice President Vance was back, and everybody wondered what kind of fireworks we might hear. And he was absolutely, I would call it gracious. His remarks, he said, look, we have differences, and we have to be able to speak plainly to each other, and criticism is okay, but fundamentally, some of the points I just made, fundamentally we share the same values, we have the same interests, we need to work together. So that was a new message. People were saying, was he on his meds or what you know? But we'll see. The next shoe may drop. You know, you just don't know. It's kind of like the tariffs. One day they're on, one day they're off. But a lot of reassessment going on in Europe too. They're thinking about these things. So.
A question in the middle.
Yeah.
Would you reflect a little bit of a possible uniting thinking of agriculture? When you look at the world, you have soybean farmers who have created decades of relationships with China. Mm-hmm. It's not something that's done casually, and there was a real bond there. It's also easy, as we've said, to do something well and then do it wrong and you're back again. Ukraine, the breadbasket of the world. Do you see in the future, if there's enough sense here, that our reuniting could perhaps occur through agricultural interchange? We obviously export more than we import. Mm-hmm. So if you take our presidents, you know, we're getting SRE, we're not. We're losing. We have great ports that do this. Yeah. And yet we have children who can't be fed here. Do you see that actually working this, there's a possibility that this could be one of the reuniting of relationships?
You know, it's a very good point, and obviously, as you say, agriculture is key. It's one of the earliest areas of trade, and it's an area where the United States, you know, with such abundance, was able to have such an impact and to feed our own prosperity, as it were. But it gets very complicated through trade rules, through others. This is one of the big issues with the European Union on agriculture policy. President Trump last week sort of surprised everybody by suddenly announcing, we've reached a big deal with the United Kingdom, a trade deal. And I was called up by all these British press in particular, would I comment on this? And I was trying to figure out, and what I finally came down to is, well, I think what they did was they reached a deal where they decided, they talked about what they will talk about. And that's okay. That's often the way, you know, the diplomatic profession works. But one of the areas was agriculture. But what about American beef? What about chicken? There's this ongoing issue about so-called chlorinated chicken. You know, basically, we have some different standards. But you talk to some Europeans, and they wouldn't touch an American chicken because they have this vision that it's been, bleached, and some of it defies the science. But those are tough issues. They're tough issues within the European Union, itself, and you look at Ukraine, here you have countries like Poland leading the way for European support of the Ukrainians against fighting against Putin's invasion and what he wants to do, essentially take this country. But yet the Poles put tariffs and limits on Ukrainian agricultural exports because the Polish farmers started saying, wait a minute, this is going to cost us. So it becomes very complex. To your main point, it is a great way, I'd say, not just agriculture, but trade in general, of developing these relationships, a better understanding. I mean, you look at the history of so-called civilization, of the human condition. Trade has been one of those things that has been good for people. Exchanging ideas, getting to know one another better, increasing your prosperity. As you know, the tariffs or the threatened tariffs on a lot of these products going to China are having an enormous impact or potential impact on American producers. Similarly, the tariffs on Chinese goods, that will come into here, what will be on the Walmart shelves? I mean, for a good 2 decades, we have, some would call it sort of bread and circuses. The bread has been cheap stuff from China. We all rely upon it. I can go pick up one of these. And there's a major contradiction there if suddenly the prices of those things go up by 148%. So we see this week that there seems to be a U.S.-Chinese discussion about solving some of that. I guess one thing I'd say, and maybe it's a little controversial, is a lot of this is theater. And we've got some leaders who are very good at theater. And that's always been politics, right? I mean, that's part of it. Dramatic moments. I think we see reflected in today's world, and I don't mean it to be just any single individual, but the sort of world of the reality show is how this stuff plays out, and we're all led to wait for a big announcement. Stay tuned, because next week, who's going to get voted off the island? And you see it with Zelensky. I mean, when there was that horrible Oval Office scene, which was really painful to watch. I mean, I know Zelensky. I spent time with Zelensky when he was a candidate, and then when he won the office, and then he was thrust into this horrible U.S. political thing with the first impeachment trial. And, I think he's been shown great leadership and courage in many ways to do what the Ukrainian people have done for the past 3 years in defending their country, and they won't stop. But he has this horrible encounter in the Oval Office, and one of my colleagues, as we were watching this, said, "Oh, well, that's the breakup episode," and said, in a couple of weeks there'll be the makeup episode. So sure enough, you have a phone call, and now it's okay, and then there's the picture of them at the Vatican, kind of sitting with each other. So there's a bit of theater to this. It's just that it's so unpredictable, and you can't know exactly what's going to come next. And it was the president himself who, at the end of that jaw-dropping scene in the Oval Office, whether he expected it to be heard and picked up or not, he was the one who said, as he left the room, "That's great TV." So there we have it. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening. When we were in Germany last summer, we were shocked at the amount of immigrants and the effect that they were already having. And I can only imagine 20 years from now. Can you speak about that and what effect that's going to have on our relations?
And that is, just as we've faced this issue with borders and migration, and that is a legacy in Germany, particularly, it goes in different layers. First of all, it's a legacy, obviously, of Angela Merkel. It was her policy that we will take these people in. Now, a lot of that started after Syria. We were talking about Syria, an area Larry knows well, and which has undergone tremendous change. And just yesterday, President Trump meeting with the new Syrian leader and removing the sanctions and big, bold moves. But there were huge numbers of Syrian refugees. Now, the Germans, under Merkel, as usual, I find, were very clever at these things. I mean, early on, the Germans were down at the borders, as it were, at the refugee camps, and looking for, any chemists, engineers, and the Syrians had lots of those. Yeah. And particularly, a lot of them had languages, English widely spoken, German, so they were very good at snatching those up. But I hope it's not a hurricane.
Those are weather alerts that people are getting on their phones, probably, right?
It's a thunderstorm. Yeah. Either that or the president.
If you could silence your phones, please.
But that's had a huge impact. I mean, they let people in, and that was very controversial, and that's led to the rise of some of the really extreme right and others on that. And people have said maybe this went too far, and it has tarnished Merkel's legacy, as has her approach to Putin, who she always thought she could control, and was pursuing, energy and keeping Germany, Nord Stream 2, and the idea that Germany would just continue to take advantage of cheap Russian hydrocarbons, clearly now acknowledged as a mistake, as they try desperately to shift away from Russian oil and gas and into renewables and other things. So that is a legacy and a challenge just as we have. Now, I do think that it's important to look at the sources of what. If
you could just the others who don't have not silenced their phones, please.
I totally sympathize, because it's happened to me in high-level meetings where everybody. The worst are the ones.
Isn't that why you retired? That's why you're the former U.S.
The worst are the ones where you're not supposed to have your phone. And it's there in your pocket, and you're thinking, oh, please don't go off. And I've seen that happen too. But it gets back to the question of what is forcing these flows? What brings these people to leave their homes and everything and want to move? And there's lots of different reasons, but one of the things I saw the Italians really force, and the Italians have had just an enormous influx over the last couple decades across the Mediterranean, sub-Saharan Africans, plus people from Middle East crises, Afghans, who have traveled, thousands of miles, often horrible conditions where they're paying these migrant guys, smugglers to bring them. And of course, they end up, if not drowning in the Mediterranean, on Lampedusa or one of these Italian islands. And the Italians actually have started to really look at, okay, what's causing this? We got to go to the root. So what did? They doubled their budgets for their diplomacy and engagement in Northern Africa and in the Middle East. They've taken their parastatal companies, big companies like Eni, the oil company, and said, all right, we want to use your expertise and understand what's going on here, and what can we do to try to get these people not to want to do that? What can we do about the governance that they're experiencing that's driving them away? Those are long-term issues and strategies, but I think they're worth investing in, and they can make a difference, so that you sort of say, hey, we want to figure out how to not have these people trying to move and coming to us, because it is overwhelming and disruptive, and then it alarms people who say, wait a minute, we can't do this. So a lot of focus still needs to go on there, and I think we experienced that in our own election just a few months ago, the big focus on migration and borders, and also understanding what was fact and why. Yeah.
Ambassador, thank you very much for the conversation this evening. I was wondering if you could speak to a little bit or share your experience in North Macedonia and talking about perspectives there on the larger obviously things like NATO and the process of trying to join the EU. You touched on the far-right extremism question, and I'm sure it has a different flavor, but the election of the Your Macedonia coalition party last year, I think Gordana Davkova, it's a different flavor than the AfD in Germany or things going on in Bucharest and Budapest with Orban and the nullification of the Georgescu elections. But to a lot of us in the the Bible Belt American South, a lot of those crazy right-wing policies actually sound very liberal from a social agenda. So I was wondering if you could maybe paint the picture of what an average North Macedonian, how they view a globalizing institution like the EU or NATO, and maybe why they voted the way they did very recently.
No, it's a great question. I'm very impressed that I'm going to tell some of them that somebody, I came to Georgia, I came to Savannah, and somebody knew about North Macedonia and their politics. I was just with the Prime Minister. In fact, I was texting him earlier, so I'm going to tell him that. He'll be very pleased, because they often feel like nobody knows anything about us. The politics there are interesting. Look, this is North Macedonia itself is this little country that has struggled with an identity, frankly. You go back to the 19th century, and Macedonia, which is a geographic descriptor, there's a geographic region that's Macedonia that's based on historical Macedonia under Alexander the Great, and things from 2,000 years ago or more. And it was Bismarck, the German leader, statesman, who was known for saying, that all the Balkans weren't worth the bones of a single Pomeranian soldier, reflecting on the wars that went on in those regions that were the targets of competing empires, the Ottomans, the Germans, the Russians, the French. And yet he said the key to stability in the Balkans, this was 200 years ago almost, the key to stability in that region is solving the so-called Macedonia question. And the Macedonia question had to do with, who are these people, who belongs? Because it's an area that's mixed, all these different ethnicities. My view, having served there a lot and spent a lot of time there, was that we have the answer to the Macedonian question, and it's this little country. It's a country that emerged from what was a region or a socialist republic within the Yugoslav Federation that was called Macedonia. And as Yugoslavia fell apart, Macedonia fell apart. They'd never been an independent country on their own. They had a very mixed ethnic thing. There are about 60% of them are ethnic Macedonian, Slavic people, who are contested. The Bulgarians say, no, they're not really, they're just, Western Bulgarians. The Greeks who said, you can't use that name. We are the true heirs of Macedonia. 30% of the population, or close to it, 28, is ethnic Albanian. Serbs from another part. So it was always a mix. My view was that crucial to the stability was that solving this question, and the answer was this country, here are its borders. That's something that was set within Yugoslavia. Multi-ethnic, which is what it is. You really can't change your neighbors. You can't change your neighborhood or your neighbors. Geography matters, and these are the people that are there. Democratic, and that's what they set out to do. Constitution, establish a democracy, and integrated into these structures that we together, under U.S. leadership really, had created. NATO for security, the European Union and that one single common market for prosperity and the economic agenda, and all of that under these sort of common values that we share. Remembering that common values don't mean that everybody's exactly the same, and understanding that people have different viewpoints. So, over these years, it's been really tough for the little Macedonians, but they've made great progress. I think getting into NATO was crucial for them. It was delayed a long time over this issue of the name with Greece, far too long. far too. I like to say I used to have hair before I took on the name issue. But we solved that, and they finally moved. We had always said, you solve the name issue, you're into NATO. You've met all the criteria. And so when they did it, and I was by then Assistant Secretary for Europe, I really pushed this and said, okay, it's done. We got to bring them in now. This is what we promised. This is crucial for completing this puzzle. And a lot of people said, wait a minute, COVID is coming. You could see this. Let's wait. And I just, pounded the table and insisted. And it was really one of the last things we did at the State Department in terms of, ambassadors coming in with the documents to ratify Macedonia's membership in NATO as North Macedonia. And then we kind of shut down for COVID, but they became the 30th member. And that's given them a level of confidence and security, so they get along with Greece. Greece provides air policing for them. They have joint exercises. They contribute troops to various common efforts, and they're good allies. The EU has been different because instead of moving swiftly to bring them into the EU, as I tried to tell my European friends, Macron decided, this is not the time to be enlarging the EU. And sure enough, before you knew it, there's a new issue with the Bulgarians having historic differences with their Macedonian neighbors, and blocking their EU accession. So that, I think, has led to a certain degree of cynicism. The biggest issue was corruption. And the reason for the change and the coalition that came in last summer was really that they were just fed up with the lack of progress and the corruption that was just so blatant, so obvious to everyone, that they voted out the other guys and voted in this team. As always in Macedonia, it's a coalition. There's a mix of largely ethnic Macedonian parties and ethnic Albanian parties that then split various roles in the government. They're having a tough time right now. They had a terrible tragedy there with a nightclub in a small town called Kočani. I think it made the news around here a lot. Over 60, mostly young people died of horrific things. One of these things where a band was lighting off fireworks inside a nightclub that didn't meet any of the safety standards, had forged all of their licenses. And in a country of less than 2 million people, where everybody knows everybody, these 60 young people being lost is still reverberating months later. And that was the Prime Minister and I talked for a long time, and he had just spent some time with the families of these young people, and it's just devastating to them. So they're kind of depressed, but they're also wondering, what's going on in America? What's with our friends? We got into NATO. Is it still going to be okay? So I tried to be reassuring, and they have a European future, I think, as do the rest of the Balkans. I mean, it's time for Europe to sort of say, hey, these are little European countries too. And if you talk about taking in Ukraine into the European Union, we will bring them in, 40 million people, enormous agricultural sector. What are the French going to say about that? If you can't bring in Macedonia with 1.9 million people, or Montenegro with 600,000 people, how are you going to bring in a country of 40 million? So that's my admonition to the Europeans. So.
Over here.
Thank you. I have a question about possible cracks in the European unity. We have several illiberal leaders currently. Romania has a problem. Slovakia, Serbia, Hungary, of course. Mm-hmm. Do you see this as a growing problem? And if Russia wins in Ukraine, however you define that, will this exacerbate the problem?
No.
How big a problem is it?
Those are good questions, and ones that they're asking. you do have, in many ways, and I know Viktor Orban. I served twice in Hungary, and the first time I was there in the mid-'90s, early and mid-'90s, my first assignment in the Foreign Service, he was still kind of a young guy who'd made a name for himself by saying, the Russians need to leave, get out, and leading this party called Fidesz, which stands for Fiatal Demokrat Szövetség, the Alliance of Young Democrats. And originally, when the party was formed, the maximum age for membership in the party was 35. Now they've changed that completely. But he used to, come around and have beers with young diplomats like me. He changed a lot and became a real populist and has led this and, pushed to get Hungary into the European Union, and then uses it as a cudgel. He takes the money, and literally, in his case, takes the money. But is then constantly undermining the EU. They have finally started to get a little more tough about that, but the EU, and I'm a believer in the EU, the idea was to create something that would prevent the wars, to lead to a greater common prosperity, unity while maintaining, your identity, allowing everyone to be a European, so that, in a country like Macedonia, it doesn't matter if you're an Albanian or a Macedonian, you're all Europeans, and you can all feel that your identity is respected and protected. They've had a hard time with that because they've made these rules that make it so difficult to do anything. And one guy, one member state, like Orban, or in the case of Fico in Slovakia, can block things. They're trying to start getting around that a little bit, but it is tough. And you see emerging, say in Romania, I keep getting text messages from this guy, George Simeon, who is the almost certain to be the next president of Romania, who is on the surface very what we would call right wing. I'm not entirely sure about him. I'm wondering if he may be a little bit like a Giorgia Meloni, who people were really concerned was this extreme right-wing figure in Italy. And she's turned out to be, yes, she has a set of views on a number of issues, culture and social issues that she professes, but she's been a tremendous transatlanticist. She gets along very well with President Trump. She's been very tough on Putin, who everyone thought she was sort of more Putin's type. So sometimes these guys can surprise you. I think if anything, besides bringing the EU and the UK into a rapprochement, the approach of the Trump administration has made the Europeans realize, hey, we got to make this work out. We can't let American politics divide us, and we've got to watch out for real extremism in some of our politics, but also have a respect for differing views. So you've seen around the world, a couple of these elections, not just in Europe, but say the Canadian election or the Australian elections, where they think they can demonstrate that there's sort of been a response to Trump has been to say those who were aligning themselves with Trump have lost elections. And we'll see where that goes. In Poland, they shifted back with their election a little over a year ago, back to sort of center-left from a center-right party. And we'll just see where some of these others go. As to the Russian question, I do think a Russian victory, and it's hard to know what that really means, because the Ukrainians aren't going to stop. We can drop them completely, let the Europeans try to help them. I think we're not going to do that, but they aren't going to just stop and fold and say, okay, we're going to become part of Russia. But Putin is building a military-based economy. You can read recently, and there's sort of alarm bells going off, that he's building, hundreds of tanks a month, and they're not being sent to the Ukrainian war, to the Ukrainian front. What's he building all these tanks for? What's next? What does he have in mind? And our allies in the little Baltic countries, who are NATO members, they are very scared and concerned. And the Poles are very scared and concerned. They realize that, they have a real threat with Putin. And the question is, can you contain him enough until he eventually passes from the scene, however that may happen. And I don't see that happening right away, but fate has a way of intervening sometimes. That's a real concern. Right now, I think Poland has built such a strong military themselves, and as now a major NATO ally, and an increasingly strong voice in the European Union. Poland could march to Moscow tomorrow with very little resistance because so much of Russia's military power is concentrated in the Ukraine fight. But that will change and evolve, which is why Poland is very much about supporting Ukraine and making sure that we see that Putin doesn't emerge from this, taking a big win. And Putin's playing a game too. We talked about, this is theater in many ways. And that's why everything President Trump says and does about Russia or Ukraine is read and seen as something. Why is he so supportive of Putin? Or is that just a tactic to try to get Putin to the table? My own feeling is that President Trump realizes too that Putin has played him for the last 3 months. Really played him. And I've dealt with these Russians. I've met Putin, and they're very good. And I just know I can just see Lavrov and Ryabkov and Ushakov and these guys just laughing at what they've been able to pull off. And I think maybe that's beginning to be realized. So we'll see what happens. I don't think he's shown up in Istanbul, has he? No.
We've seen how difficult it is in the United States to cut our social programs, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, et cetera, during all the recent budget negotiations. Do you think that the EU, which those countries have a much more significant social-based program, do you think that really there's a will for them to cut so that they can get, raise money for military and other security issues?
Phil, I have two more questioners, but we have to be brief. So
Okay.
your questions and your answers.
Great,
Be
yeah,
brief,
I should be.
because we have to go.
Not
from
so.
this place.
I could go on all night, but we'll. Quickly on that, I do think there's a fundamental change. I think they know they've got to spend on defense, and so it's hard. And you saw, as I mentioned, the first thing they've done was shift. The UK is one example, not in the EU, but one of the European allies. They've shifted all their money from development to defense. That's where they went first. Now they got to face, the National Health Service and these other things. And these are big, difficult questions, just like we're experiencing too. And I think that's been part of the point. And the criticism was, hey, it's great for you guys to live this lifestyle. Denmark is a great example. But Denmark is one that, has met its percentages and has done enormous shift to defense, understanding their need, and yet they've been treated, in my view, just abominably. The things that our leaders have said about Denmark, who's mean to Denmark, is outrageous. So I think there's been a pushback there from the population saying, we're going to do this on our own, and we're going to take care of ourselves and figure out how we do that. And that's where the question about productivity and economics comes in. They've got to get their act together and start being more productive. This is the cradle of the Renaissance. Come on, Europe. It's time for you to do that. And best if they do it with us, because the Chinese are doing it on their own.
Last question over here, Phil, briefly.
Thank you, Ambassador. Actually, I can probably piggyback off that one. There's been a significant rise in European defense firms, both individually within European countries and with other countries not being the United States. Joseph Nye talks about a concept called smart power, with combining your hard power and your soft power to make adequate decisions about statecraft or things like that. My question to you is this a significant loss of smart power with the United States and specifically our interaction with Russia? And also, Are we going to lose on the development wars? Because if essentially the Russians essentially the Russians or the Europeans are looking at those specific battlefields with AI and drones and all that good stuff, are we going to lose our strategic edge within our ability to wage warfare?
No, those are great questions, and I think Joe Nye, of course, just passed
away
last week. I just a total coincidence. I listened to him something that the Washington Institute for Foreign Affairs had him as a guest, literally a week before he died. Very interesting stuff, and he talked about, as you said, smart power. He first coined the phrase soft power and the importance of that. It's interesting on the defense spending. There's going to be these enormous increases in defense spending in Europe, hundreds of billions, 800 billion euros. So we're talking close to $1 trillion over the next few years. More defense spending here. American firms are going to be part of this. I mean, there's this debate. Some in Europe were saying, "Hey, wait a minute. If that's going to be the attitude of the Americans, we're not going to buy American." Well, they're going to have to buy American because there are no other options. I think what they need to do is start working together. And in fact, and I learned this not only from my previous work, but now in the private sector, so many of the major defense things, they're multinational anyway. The big projects are conglomerates that are doing this part here, that technology there, working together, because we got to compete with the Chinese too. The Ukrainians will be very good with this. And there I can put in an ad for, I've been trying to build in our practice advising companies on how to engage in Ukraine's reconstruction, and that means investing in things. And one sector is defense in Ukraine. They were, going back to Soviet times, very forward in defense industry. And now what they've done in terms of innovation with drones and other things during these 3 years of this war is quite incredible. So there's a lot to be learned there, and some American firms are looking at that, and I think European firms will as well. But you'll see big growth, and if you just look at sort of some of the market valuations, startups, defense startups in Europe, big boom. This is a time, and it's not, I said boom, we had a saying at Albright Stonebridge Group is that we don't do things that go boom. So we didn't traditionally do your standard military work with those companies. But now defense isn't about boom. It's about cyber, it's hybrid, it's your AI, it's your hypersonic stuff. It's all technology. And technology on the battlefield, it's changed in less than a decade. The whole concept of warfighting has really changed dramatically. So it's a very interesting area to look at. And once again, and it's a good way to end, it's where I think the United States and Europe, as we always have, going back to defeating the Nazis and Imperial Japan, work together as a unified force, solving our problems and differences, and sharing and shaping not only the defense capabilities we need to have, but building a future based on the values that I think we fundamentally know we have. So,
I have to say that when I was an inexperienced deputy ambassador in Slovakia, my first time in Europe, the first thing I did was to reach out to Phil Reeker, who had the same position in Budapest, Hungary, and a couple of other our other neighbors, DCMs in the neighborhood in Prague and in Warsaw. But I hugely benefited from Phil's counsel and his creativity, which is, I think, one thing that really distinguishes Phil within our foreign service. And the other thing he mentioned himself, which is he bites onto an issue and doesn't let go, like on North Macedonia.
That's right.
And NATO. And I'm very appreciative that he bites onto things and doesn't let them go. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you all.
For coming.
Great.
Forget your phone.
I will not forget that.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you all and ask for another round of applause. But thank you. Very interesting talk. As you know, we look forward to seeing you back in the fall when we will have an equally interesting collection of programs. as a final note, as you know, we're an all-volunteer board, and we are all-volunteer membership. Please make sure you carry your own garbage out. We'll see you next fall.
As the song
Thank you so
goes,
much.
see you in September, right?
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks.